What is up, everybody? This is Josh, and we're in a new TCG format, new set, new ban list. So of course I'm here today to talk about that and bring you guys a little bit of a tier list and a discussion on which decks I think are going to be performing well and not so well in this upcoming crossover breaker format. As always, if there are any decks out there that I'm missing on here and you guys would like my opinion, make sure to drop a comment. I'll try to answer as many as I can. Hope you enjoy the content. If you do, make sure to leave a like on the video and subscribe to the channel. It would really mean a lot to me. Without further ado, let's get into the video. Now, starting with Snake Eyes, I would rate that deck relatively low right now, simply because losing original Sinful Spoils basically cuts you off of too many starters. I do think the pure Snake Eye deck as it has existed is not really a thing anymore, and I am quite happy about that. So I'm going to throw it way down here in unplayable territory. I do think it is the deck that suffered the hardest from this latest ban list. Now, of course, theoretically, you can still print a lot of bodies with Bonfire into Snake Eye Ash, into Poplar, into like Divine Temple, and then tag out into Flamberge. However, I do think at this point, when you lose the Wanteds and Diabell Stars as starters, the ratio between good cards and bad cards in your deck just doesn't really add up anymore. So I don't think we're going to see this deck anytime soon. Yubel, on the other hand, I think is much better than people give it credit for, and I think it is still very, very scary. Versus Ryzeal in particular, going second, it's going to be hard. When Yubel goes first, it is still very, very potent. Phantom being at 1 really only impacts it in the grind game, I feel like. Still having access to the full Fiendschmidt package is also huge for this deck, because you can pivot into aerial ether lines super easily in the middle of your combo. So I do think Yubel is at the very minimum a high tier 2 deck. It could even be like tier 1.5. Whether it's going to end up being played a lot is a different question, because like if you want to play a combo deck, then I think people are going to like pivot more towards Maliss. But at the end of the day, Yubel is still a very good deck in my opinion. Funnily enough, I feel like Tenpai out of these three is the deck that is seeing the most experimentation with at the moment. People are bringing like Fenrir's into Dracosac, into Cherubini, send one of the Tenpai monsters and then revive it with Promethean Princess. I don't think that sort of stuff is completely unviable. At the same time, I feel like it is so much more vulnerable than it used to be. That was kind of like Tenpai's thing, right? Like Tenpai was super hard to interact with. And suddenly, like your Effect Veilers, your Impermanences, and all those kind of cards, they're alive now. You can just hit the Draco Sack with them, even if they have the field spell. So I do think the deck is much more vulnerable and much less consistent than before. I personally don't think it's going to be more than a tier 3 deck. I think people are just messing around with it because they want to, because they still have the cards, and because they see it as a fun challenge to make Tenpai work in this new environment. I don't think it's because it's actually a really good deck. Branded losing Jaugen and Gimmick Puppet Nightmare is cool. I think that makes it still possible to lock with certain cards. It's just like those were the ones, or mainly Gimmick Puppet Nightmare was the one that was played for a good reason. With one Branded Fusion, I don't think Branded is particularly good. It is also not particularly bad though. Like I feel like it's lower end of tier 2 for me personally. It's just very powerful if it has access to Branded Fusion, and the Ryzeal deck in particular, what's probably going to be the most represented deck in the format, allows for like its boards to be broken and interacted with, even if you don't play like a bunch of hand traps. With Branded is one of those decks that benefits from that because it has high engine count, right? Like Branded is the type of deck that can break boards with engine. Beating Maliss going second is going to be a different kind of beast, because like that deck can banish your graveyard very efficiently, and that's a problem for Branded. That deck also plays Bestials, so I'm putting it like lower end of tier 2. Labrynth is a deck that I've heard a lot of rumors about, let's say, before YCS Anaheim, that a lot of people were going to play it because it is very good against Ryzeal. I've seen Labrynth in practice, and I wasn't like super convinced by its Ryzeal matchup. It's not bad by any means, but beating Detonator with the deck is still difficult, because like whenever you activate your trap cards, Detonator is going to pop other trap cards and so on and so forth. I still found the matchup to be quite annoying, honestly, and not auto win at all. I do think Labrynth is like a solid tier 2 strategy. I'm hesitant to give it more than that. Memento is a deck that I have a lot of respect for, and last format it was actually one of the decks that I was considering. I do think if the trend goes more towards a mix between hand traps and board breakers, and the overall number of hand traps is going down, which is absolutely a trend that we're seeing right now in this format, I think Memento is one of the decks that could benefit from that. It's relatively resilient to cards like Fuvalos and Perulia. For me personally, this is probably going to be either high tier 2 or low tier 1.5. There's going to be a bunch of decks above it, but I do think this is a deck that's pretty strong. I actually forgot to put Mermail in here. I'm hoping the editor can just put that in here. I think Mermail is in a relatively similar spot. With Snake Eye and Yubel losing a lot of popularity and hand traps going down in usage, I think those are kind of like the combo decks that can replace Snake Eye. The Mermail deck, I just feel like has a little bit of a consistency issue. I think it is in tier 2 still, right around the level of Branded. I think it's a deck that should be respected, and I think the trend should be like play a decent amount of hand traps in your main deck and then maybe add a couple more more after siding, just in case you do run into Memento, Yubel, or something like Mermail, because those decks, even though they're not going to be the most dominant forces in the metagame, they are going to exist in some way, shape, or form. Ritual Beast, I think, is still good. I think it was a very solid tier 2 deck before the ban list. I don't think much changes in regards to Ritual Beast. I guess a small downside is the fact that Maliss does not care about Shifter, but that is also only partially true, because not care is a strong word, because the Maliss combos are still weaker under Shifter, whereas the Ritual Beast combos are still absolutely fine. So I think if you're playing Ritual Beast against Maliss, you're actually not upset if you open Shifter. I do think Nibiru is going to be a very popular card, because I do think it's good against both Ryzeal and Maliss, and that is a little bit of a problem for Ritual Beast. Of course, there are lines that play around it, I'm aware. It still is something that's going to cost you a couple of games in a tournament, so I think middle of the pack tier 2 seems fair for Ritual Beast for me. Rescue Ace, you're gaining your airlifters back, but you're losing the entire Diabellstar package. I think the deck is less consistent than it was before, and that is a problem because consistency has always been an issue for Rescue Ace. In raw power level, it's fine. I think consistency wise, there's just other decks that do better than it. Maybe it's just because no one's really playing it and I haven't seen it in a very long time that I'm not really putting enough respect on Rescue Ace. Let me know if you've tried it and you think it's better than this. I personally don't see much potential here. Runick White Forest, one of my favorite decks of 2024, is getting better with this ban list update, because the Snake Eyes and Yubel matchups being so popular this year made it really hard for this deck to compete, because against those decks, going second with a deck that has a very low non-engine count was always a problem. Ryzeal is the kind of deck where you can very realistically win with just like one non-engine, and it doesn't even have to be a hand trap, it can just be board breakers, which is something that the Runick decks really like to do. So I do think Runick White Forest benefits from that. Maliss is still really hard going second. The most annoying part about playing against Maliss is that when you use your Runick spells, sometimes you just give them a free extender or starter because you just banish one of the Maliss monsters and it comes back. It used to be like a tier 3 deck, I think, before this ban list. It moves up to like a tier 2 position. And that is coming from someone who really likes this deck. I'm probably even a little bit biased towards it. I'm still not putting it higher than that. Centurion is just solid. I think its main problem is that preventing Detonator is really, really hard. And Centurion really is the kind of deck that would like to play a lot of hand traps. Now, the format is not one where you will want to play 20 hand traps or whatever. I think it's like middle of the pack tier 2 as well. Ironically, I think for Centurion, the Maliss matchup is probably better than the Ryzeal matchup. And because I think Ryzeal is more popular than Maliss, I think that's a problem. Let's talk about Ryzeal while we're at it. I do think both of these decks are very, very strong and obviously also very, very popular. Pure Ryzeal, I'm going to put in tier 1.5 just because the deck is a little bit lacking in consistency. That's basically it. The power level of this deck in general is just not that high. It's a very solid deck. It has very resilient combos to hand traps. It ends on Detonator very consistently, so that kind of forces the game into like a grindy game state, which I really, really enjoy about Ryzeal. I feel like the pure version was just lacking a little bit of that extra oomph, right? Because there's only 12 Ryzeal starters, including Bonfire. It's kind of like that middle ground where like it's playable, but you will have games where you just pass or you just get hand trapped on the first thing you do and then you just pass. It's still a good deck though, because this is the version of Ryzeal that you play if you want the maximum amount of non-engine, right? I do personally prefer right now the Ryzeal Fiendschmidt. I think that was a great solution to those problems because it gives Ryzeal better grind game. It gives Ryzeal more plays. So if you like don't have access to the Ryzeal cards or they get interrupted, you can use Fiendschmidt cards or vice versa. The Fiendschmidt cards also give it an extra disruption with the Fiendschmidt in Paradise. All around, I just think this is a very solid concept. I don't think it's super oppressive. Everything that has a good pure Ryzeal matchup is still going to perform fine into Fiendschmidt Ryzeal. It's just that little bit better. Maliss, also a very strong deck. I think I'm putting it here. The main issue for Maliss is consistency because it really only has 6 good starters. That is 3 Dormouse and 3 White Rabbit. The field spell combos are already a little bit weaker. And then when we're talking everything else, we're already talking like multiple card combinations like Allure plus drawing into one of those starters or Signet Mining plus a discard, which is weak to a lot of hand traps. Still, with just one wave of support or like the initial wave of the printing, this deck is already viable and just consistent enough to be a top tier threat. The benefit of Maliss as well in this format is that like everyone is going to be building their decks for Ryzeal, which is smart. It's the right thing to do. But Maliss is pretty good against a lot of the cards that are good against Ryzeal, right? Like if people do like half hand traps, half power spells, that's pretty good for Maliss because then you're more likely to play through their hand traps. If Maliss plays, then it's not really that weak to board breakers because the board is very layered. You know, you have Terahertz with the spell trap negation, you have the trap card, so even if someone's playing like Dark Ruler or Droplet or whatever, you can use that later, and you've got all those kind of interactions from the graveyard and some from hand as well. So like the Maliss deck is very resilient to board breakers. In terms of which version of the Maliss deck, I personally couldn't tell you exactly which one I think is the best. I do think adding extra engine to it, similar to the Ryzeal situation, makes sense. So adding striker cards, adding Bestials, even though they're not really non-engine in the deck, I think is good. From what I've seen, there's even Fiendsmith versions that did well at the German Open, which I also thought made a lot of sense. I think some extra engines should be in the Maliss. The pure Fiendsmith deck is my favorite deck of the last format. It is still good. I do like this deck a lot because of how flexible it is and because of how much you can do with it. I do think that for the current situation, the pure Fiendsmith deck has fallen off a little bit. The Ryzeal matchup is really good for the deck. I noticed that when I brought it to YCS Anaheim, I beat every single Ryzeal I played. Maliss is a really hard matchup though, and it also struggles with the things that people do against Ryzeal. You really only need one hand trap, and what you do is you just hand trap the sequence. If it's imperm, you just hold the imperm for the Caesar in case they go for that. And if you hand trap that one thing, then the Fiendsmith engine passes on very little interaction, maybe like a Fiendsmith in Paradise. And then if the rest of your non-engine is cards like Talents or Crossout or Droplet or Called by the Grave, those kind of cards, really good against Fiendsmith. So the pure Fiendsmith deck was really good when everyone was trying to like hand trap war each other. That is not the case anymore. However, I'm still gonna put it here because I do think the deck has enough flexibility to the point where it could just pop up again. You can make this deck whatever you want it to be. You can take out some of the hand traps and play a secondary engine, right? You can play a higher musket count, you can play a higher Ashira count. One huge benefit of the Fiendsmith decks is that Dominus Impulse is one of the best hand traps you can have against Ryzeal because it can't get Talents, it can't get called by, and it also can't get cross-outed because they won't play it. But mainly, I think like the reason why I'm putting it lower than I would have done it last format is that like the Ryzeal Fiendsmith deck just seems to be like a better version. It's kind of what I've just mentioned. Like it's like the Fiendsmith cards, but adding another engine into it, which just happens to be Ryzeal, and that just ends up going very well together. So I think that might just be a new and improved version of the deck. For now, I'm leaving it in here because I do have some faith in it. Tier 1.5 I think is a fair assessment for now. Chimera is a strong combo deck that can break boards with engine. All those things are very, very nice into Ryzeal. The Maliss matchup, you should probably win going first and lose going second. Overall, I think that makes it like a tier 2-ish deck. It's a fine pick, especially with Fiendsmith still being at full power. Runick Stun, I think is pretty bad right now. The Ryzeal matchup for any kind of stun deck is pretty abysmal, which is the nice thing about a card like Ryzeal Detonator because like it deals very efficiently with floodgates. You even have Aggregator to negate floodgates right off the bat as well, or negate Fountain at the start of your turn. So I think any kind of stun deck, I don't think they're going to be a thing for this format. White Forest Azamina, I think is probably your best bet if you're trying to play something with the Bellstar and Wanted. I do think you can do some nice things with the Azamina engine even without Snake Eye. I do think it's a little bit of a shame that so far the only thing that people have played Azamina in is really Snake Eyes. I do think that it has other applications. Azamina gets a boost with Supreme Darkness coming out in early 2025. Until then, unless someone changes my mind, I don't think this deck is better than tier 3. However, this is one of those decks where I don't really know because I haven't played it much myself, and I wouldn't be surprised if it was better than this. The question is someone going to put in the work and the time that's necessary to make this deck work? Because it feels like with solid non-engine talents and stuff like that, this deck can take apart Ryzeal board super easily, and it probably also has a very strong grind game because of like Deception, and the Azamina cards in general and the White Forest cards too have also really good grind games. So maybe I'm underestimating this just because I haven't played it. I'm actually interested in this deck at some point, like to maybe mess around with it and see if it's already viable. Voiceless Voice, I'm trying to think if this deck is better or worse than Centurion. Probably slightly worse, but the concept of these two decks is kind of like the same. I think the problem of both of these decks is that they just can't beat Detonator, right? Like everything that relies on continuous spell cards to do its thing has a huge issue with Detonator, right? Like all other decks are kind of fine with Detonator, even though like 3 pops on one card sounds like it's a lot. For those two decks, I think it's tough. And so that is the overall situation. Of course, I can't cover every single deck, but let me know if there's anything else you would like my opinion on. Let me know if you agree or disagree on any of the things I said. I just want to say one general thing before we leave off. I do think this format looks incredibly exciting. Don't let the fact that Ryzeal Fiendsmith is the only deck up here fool you into thinking like there's not going to be diversity or it's going to be oppressing all other decks in the format. I don't think that's going to be the case because as you've heard, with like so many decks that I put in tier 1.5 or tier 2, they are specifically viable in this format because they can deal with Ryzeal. Because Ryzeal is a deck that doesn't really push anything out of the format. It doesn't really demand you to draw like 4 hand traps to even have a chance going second. It also doesn't put up like crazy amounts of like Omni negates or anything like that. It's usually just as simple as if you have 1 hand trap for the detonator, which is honestly a realistic thing to do even if you only play like 9 or 12 hand trap on duo drive rather, then they're just going to pass on detonator and some non-engine, and that is something that a lot of decks that even work with just mainly engine can play against, right? It's like pretty cool in that regard, where like you can probably make any somewhat decent rogue deck viable into Ryzeal if you just pick the right non-engine into it, and I'll have videos covering that as well. I personally think 2025 Yu-Gi-Oh is looking very, very fun. I'm looking forward to it a lot. I'm just wondering if you guys share that opinion or not. Let me know in the comments down below. I hope you found this video interesting. If you did, once again, make sure to subscribe to the channel. It would mean a lot to me. You guys have a wonderful rest of your day, and thank you for watching.